Sometimes the thing you lose doesn't fade away. It waits for the moment you're ready to see it again. In 1983, a teenage girl vanished during a walk that should have lasted 9 minutes. For 27 years, her name faded from headlines, her poster from telephone poles, until her silver necklace, engraved with AG, was found tangled in old insulation inside a stranger's attic. Who put it there? Was it a trophy? Or a message? Today, I'm breaking down the red flags no one saw, the warning signs that surrounded Amy Garrison's disappearance, and the secret that someone in Maple Ridge worked decades to keep buried. It's November 5th, 1983. The air in Maple Ridge, Oregon, is crisp, carrying that faint mineral scent that signals approaching rain. Street lights flicker weakly against the mist rising from the forest edges that surround the town. Timber country, a place where everyone knows everyone, where doors are rarely locked, and where 16-year-old Amy Garrison is saying goodbye to her friends after watching The Big Chill at Marianne Clark's house. "You sure you don't want me to drive you?" Marianne's mother calls from the kitchen. The clock on the wall reads 8:50 p.m. "It's just up the road," Amy answers, adjusting her denim jacket and slinging her backpack over one shoulder. The silver necklace her father gave her for her birthday, engraved with her initials AG, catches the porch light as she waves. 9 minutes, I'll be home before you even start the car." 9 minutes. That's all it should have taken. Amy steps off the porch and into the November evening, walking the same route she's taken hundreds of times before. Marianne watches from the window for a moment, just long enough to see Amy turn the corner where Oak Ridge Lane meets the county road. When the Clark family goes to bed later that night, they assume Amy has reached home safely. She never does. By morning, Amy's absence begins to feel like a silent alarm only a few people can hear. Her sister, Laura, remembers hearing their dog bark around 9:20 p.m., a sound she ignored at the time, assuming it was responding to a passing car or forest animal. Her father, Frank Garrison, left for his night shift at the lumber mill before Amy should have arrived home. He assumes Amy stayed the night with a friend, as she sometimes did when he worked nights. Laura assumes her sister left early for school. By the time anyone realizes Amy is missing, 15 hours have passed. The town of Maple Ridge, known for its close community and safe atmosphere, becomes suddenly alien. Something doesn't add up. The local sheriff's office files a report, missing juvenile, possible runaway. But neighbors whisper, how could a girl just vanish in 9 minutes of road? "People don't disappear here," Laura Garrison tells me, her hands clutching a coffee mug as we sit in the same kitchen where she once waited for her sister to come home. She's in her 50s now, but the memory remains raw. "We live in the woods, sure, but that road was lit. Cars pass every few minutes. Someone had to see something, but no one did. Or at least no one admitted they did." For Detective Mara Ellison, who would eventually reopen the case decades later, the initial investigation contains more questions than answers. "I keep coming back to those 9 minutes, Ellison says. 9 minutes to walk less than half a mile. Even if Amy had stopped to tie her shoe, even if she'd paused to look at the stars, she should have been home by 9:15 at the latest. Something interrupted that walk. Something or someone. Amy's route traced a narrow wooded lane that dipped briefly into a valley before cutting past the abandoned Millview paper mill. Initial search teams found footprints matching Amy's sneakers on the dirt shoulder for approximately half a mile. Then they stopped near a section where tire tracks overlapped the path. Sheriff Dale Palmer noted in his report that rain later that night could have washed away evidence further down the road. But what he didn't include, what wouldn't be discovered until decades later, was that the tire tracks matched the standard issue tires used by the sheriff's department. More specifically, they matched the white Ford truck driven by Deputy Raymond Holt, who lived in the valley just beyond where Amy's footprints ended. Nobody thought to question why Deputy Holt's truck might have been there, Ellison tells me. He was a respected officer, lived nearby, and would naturally patrol that area. But here's what bothers me. If he was patrolling and saw a teenage girl walking alone at night, why wouldn't he offer her a ride? And if he did, why wouldn't he report that when she was declared missing? The question hangs in the air, unanswered. 3 days into the search, volunteer Elias Danner found Amy's denim jacket 12 feet off the road, snagged on a blackberry bush near Millview Creek. The discovery initially seemed promising, a clue that might lead to Amy's whereabouts. But upon closer inspection, investigators found something odd. The jacket had no tears, Laura recalls, no scratches, nothing to suggest she'd been running through brambles. It was just placed there, half zipped, exactly like she was wearing it when she left Mary Ann's house. The placement seemed deliberate, staged, and there was something else. The silver necklace Amy always wore was missing. That necklace meant everything to her, Frank Garrison told investigators at the time. Her mother gave it to me before she passed, asked me to give it to Amy on her 16th birthday. Amy never took it off. Not for swimming, not for sleeping. Never. Mary Ann Clark provided what seemed like a crucial detail during her interview. According to her statement, Amy had used the payphone outside Pine's Grocery around 8:57 p.m., just minutes after leaving the Clark home. She said she was calling her dad at the mill, letting him know she was walking home, Mary Ann told. Police said she'd be home soon, but there was no record of that call. No one at the mill remembered connecting Amy to her father. The phone company later found that the line had been malfunctioning that night. No outgoing calls had been registered between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. Had Amy even made the call? Or had Mary Ann misremembered this detail? More puzzling still, why would Amy need to call her father if she knew he was working the night shift and wouldn't be home anyway? This discrepancy would become significant years later when investigators revisited the timeline of events. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the initial investigation was how slowly it moved. The first organized police search didn't begin until nearly 24 hours after Amy was reported missing, a delay that would be unthinkable in similar cases today. They kept saying she was probably a runaway, Laura tells me, her voice hardening. Teen girl, dad works nights, mom passed away years before. They thought she just took off for Portland or Seattle. Even when we found her jacket, they said she might have discarded it deliberately to throw us off. The officer assigned to lead the search efforts was Deputy Raymond Holt. Witnesses recall that he focused search teams on areas south of town, in the opposite direction from Amy's walking route home. When volunteers suggested expanding the search to include the woods near his own property, where Amy's footprints had ended, Holt dismissed the idea. "Not worth the manpower," he reportedly said. "Checked it myself already. Nothing there." No one questioned his assessment. After all, who would doubt the word of Maple Ridge's most respected deputy? Later reports would reveal that Holt had taken a personal interest in Amy's case. He volunteered for extra shifts, kept copies of witness statements at home, and personally conducted follow-up interviews with Amy's friends, often without filing formal reports. His dedication seemed admirable at the time. In retrospect, it resembled something else entirely. As the search for Amy continued, a pattern emerged in witness statements, a detail mentioned but never thoroughly investigated. 3 separate individuals reported seeing a white Ford truck idling near the crossroads, where Amy would have passed around 9 p.m. Mike Larson, then a high school senior, told police he'd driven past Deputy Holt's truck on his way home from a date. The statement was noted, but not pursued. After all, Holt lived in the area and frequently patrolled those roads. Elderly resident Edith Warner, whose house overlooked the intersection, mentioned to a volunteer searcher that she'd seen the deputy's white truck sitting there with the lights off, around the time Amy would have been walking by. When asked why she hadn't mentioned this to police, Warner reportedly said, "They didn't ask." The third witness was a timber worker heading home from a late shift. He passed the same intersection around 9:15 p.m. and noticed a white, official-looking truck parked at an odd angle, its headlights dark. The driver was not visible. This statement made it into the report but was never connected to the other sightings. 3 witnesses, 1 white truck, 0 follow-up. It's like they had all the puzzle pieces but refused to connect them, Detective Ellison explains. Or maybe they saw the picture forming and deliberately scattered the pieces. The connection would remain buried for nearly 3 decades, until a discovery in an attic 150 miles away would force the truth into the light. Sometimes, Laura Garrison says, staring out her kitchen window toward the forest where her sister vanished, the most obvious answer is the one you don't want to see. It would take 27 years and a haunted attic for someone to finally question why that truck was parked there at all. The next 72 hours in Maple Ridge blur into one continuous fog, literally and emotionally. Rain falls in sheets, turning search efforts into muddy ordeals. Volunteers grid search the woods surrounding the road where Amy disappeared. The local church opens its hall as a coordination base. Missing posters go up across Main Street, Amy's school picture smiling from telephone poles and shop windows. But the deeper they search, the less they find. By day 4, whispers replace progress. Amy's classmates report strange conversations she'd had days before, talk about wanting to leave town, of arguments with her father, of a man who wouldn't take no for an answer. Law enforcement shifts the case classification. Possible runaway, under stress. Frank Garrison fights against the classification. "My daughter didn't run away," he insists to Sheriff Palmer. "Something happened to her." But the tide has already turned. The sheriff's department begins scaling back search efforts. Volunteer numbers dwindle. The story that takes root, the one that will define Amy's case for years to come, is that of a troubled teenager who chose to disappear. It's a convenient narrative, a comforting one. It allows the town to stop looking for monsters in their midst. 5 days after Amy's disappearance, Frank Garrison uses his savings to hire a private bloodhound unit from Portland. The handler, Terrence Webb, arrives with a specially trained dog named Echo. Using Amy's unwashed pillowcase for scent, Echo begins tracking from the Clark residence, following Amy's route precisely. What happens next is documented only in Webb's private notes, shared decades later with Detective Ellison. Dog followed consistent trail along road for 0.6 miles, then suddenly turned, heading directly perpendicular to road into woods. Trail continued 50 yards to clearing where multiple scent patterns indicated subject remained stationary for several minutes. From clearing, scent trail led back to road, but dog refused to continue in original direction. Instead, trail led straight toward town, specifically toward Sheriff's substation on Birch Lane. When handler questioned unexpected route, accompanying Deputy Holt suggested dog had lost original scent. Handler disagreed. Dog showed strong alert behavior. Before reaching station, dog alerted strongly to white utility truck in municipal parking area, then lost interest. Deputy Holt dismissed finding as unrelated. Search terminated at deputy's request. Webb's report never made it into the official case file. When asked why he didn't push harder, the handler's response was telling, "You don't argue with small-town law enforcement in their own territory, especially when they're looking at you like you've just accused one of their own." The bloodhound had led directly to Deputy Holt's assigned vehicle, and no one officially documented it. In small towns, danger rarely comes from strangers in dark vans. It comes from familiar faces, the coach, the neighbor, the deputy offering to help drive someone home. Amy had mentioned a man who sometimes followed her after school events, according to her friend Mary Ann. "She didn't seem scared, just uncomfortable," Mary Ann recalls. She said he was always super nice, offering rides when it was raining, but something about it felt off to her. When asked if Amy had identified this person, Marianne's response is hesitant. I think I think it was someone from the sheriff's department, but I can't remember who. Former classmates paint a picture of Amy as observant and cautious, not the type to get into a stranger's vehicle willingly. But what if the vehicle wasn't driven by a stranger? What if it belonged to someone she'd been taught to trust? In Maple Ridge, we were raised to respect law enforcement, Laura explains. If a deputy told you to get in his car, you did it without question. They were the good guys. But sometimes the monster wears a badge. As the investigation stalled, contradictions emerged in official statements. Deputy Holt claimed he was home watching a basketball game that night, his whereabouts confirmed by his wife. But when interviewed again weeks later, Mrs. Holt hesitated. I might have gone to bed early, she amended. Ray watches those games with the volume down so as not to disturb me. I can't be certain what time he was home. Marianne Clark initially insisted she'd seen Amy pass the Miller Creek sign, near Holt's property, minutes before vanishing. The statement was documented, then mysteriously retracted days later. When asked about the change, Marianne's father intervened. There was pressure, Laura tells me, not explicit threats, just suggestions that Marianne might be confusing the timeline and making things harder for everyone. Her father told me later that an officer, he wouldn't say who, had strongly advised them to let the professionals handle it. The pattern continued. Witnesses who initially provided details about the white truck or unusual activity near the mill found their statements minimized or omitted from official records. The investigation became less about finding Amy and more about controlling the narrative. One witness refused to be silenced. Mike Larson, the high school senior who reported seeing Holt's truck near the intersection, continued to insist his statement was accurate despite growing community pressure. Then something happened that scared him into silence, Laura says. His parents received an unmarked envelope in their mailbox. Inside was a clipping of Amy's missing poster and a handwritten note that said simply, "Let it rest." The message spread through town. Don't ask questions. Don't dig too deep. Let the official story stand. In Maple Ridge, silence wasn't just a symptom, it was policy, Laura says bitterly. People convinced themselves that the silence was protecting the town's reputation, their property values, their peace of mind. But all it did was protect whoever took my sister. Communities crave closure. It gives pain an endpoint, a boundary beyond which normal life can resume. When the police officially classified Amy's case as a runaway 3 weeks after her disappearance, Maple Ridge collectively exhaled. They could stop looking, stop worrying, stop wondering if a monster walked among them. There was this weird relief, Laura recalls. People started saying things like, "At least she chose to leave," or "She'll come home when she's ready," as if that was better than the alternative, as if my sister had simply decided to vanish without a word to anyone. Frank Garrison refused to accept this narrative. He continued to search on his own, hiking the woods around the mill every weekend, following up on tips that the sheriff's department had dismissed. His persistence made people uncomfortable. It disrupted the comfortable fiction the town had embraced. Dad became the problem, Laura says. The crazy father who couldn't accept that his daughter had run away. People stopped inviting him to things, stopped making eye contact at the grocery store. His boss at the mill suggested he take some time off, time that eventually became permanent. The family that should have received the most support found themselves isolated instead. Their grief became inconvenient, a reminder of questions better left unasked. For Amy's sister Laura, silence eventually became safety. The cost of asking questions, of pushing against the town's accepted narrative, had proven too high. Her father's mental health deteriorated, as he continued his solitary search. Their family name became synonymous with tragedy and obsession. "I was 18 when Amy disappeared," Laura explains, "just starting community college. I had plans, but after she vanished, after what happened to Dad, I couldn't leave, I couldn't move on, but I also couldn't keep fighting the whole town, so I stopped asking questions, stopped demanding answers. That silence became her prison for 27 years. I told myself I was protecting what was left of my family, that Dad couldn't handle any more disappointment. But the truth is, I was scared of what I might find if I kept looking." The silence pact extended beyond the Garrison family. Former Sheriff Dale Palmer retired early, citing health concerns. Deputy Raymond Holt was promoted to sergeant, then retired with honors in 2002 after a distinguished career. The town named a softball field after him. Amy's case gathered dust in the county archives, officially unsolved, but effectively abandoned. Her school yearbook photo appeared once a year in the town paper on the anniversary of her disappearance, a ritual acknowledgement that gradually shrank from front page to inside column to brief mention. Maple Ridge moved on, life continued. The forest reclaimed sections of the old mill road. New families moved in, unaware of the story that had once consumed the town. Amy became a ghost story, a cautionary tale parents told teenagers about walking alone at night. For 27 years, the truth lay buried, not in the forest where everyone had searched, but in the collective silence of a town that chose comfort over justice. Until one day in 2010, when an object that should not exist surfaced in a place it should never have been. It's 2010. A rental house in Eugene, Oregon, is being cleared out by Thomas Holt, the son of the late Deputy Raymond Holt. The elder Holt had died of a heart attack 8 years earlier, his reputation intact, his secrets, presumably, buried with him. The attic, untouched for decades, is suffocating. Boxes marked "Storage, 1983," dust thick enough to muffle sound. Thomas, a high school teacher with no connection to law enforcement, has been putting off this final task for months. His father's house was sold years ago, but these boxes remained in storage, moved repeatedly without ever being opened. "Dad was weirdly protective of his old work stuff," Thomas explains during our interview. "He had this one area of the garage no one was allowed to touch. After he died, Mom just had everything packed up and stored. When she passed last year, it all came to me." Beneath a layer of fiberglass insulation that had partially collapsed from the ceiling, Thomas finds a small, tarnished chain. The pendant catches the light through the attic window, engraved initials, AG. Thomas initially dismisses it as coincidence, but something nags at him. A memory of his father acting strangely when a news report about a missing girl came on TV years before. That night, Thomas types "Maple Ridge Missing Girl 1983 into a search engine. Everything aligns. Amy Garrison, 16, silver necklace with initials. The realization hits like static electricity. His father's past might not be as honorable as the town claimed. The box containing the necklace holds more than just the pendant. Beneath it lies a folder of newspaper clippings about Amy's disappearance, handwritten notes in his father's distinctive script, and a single Polaroid photograph, blurred but clearly showing a teenage girl's silhouette near a road sign matching Maple Ridge's old highway route. "I felt sick," Thomas admits. "My whole life, my father was this hero, the respected deputy everyone looked up to, the man they named a baseball field after. And suddenly, I'm holding what looks like evidence, trophy items, things only the person who took Amy Garrison would have." Thomas's world fractures. The father he idolized suddenly becomes a stranger, possibly a monster. The implications are too horrific to process immediately. "I sat in that attic for hours," he says, "trying to find some innocent explanation. Maybe Dad was working the case privately. Maybe he found these items and kept them as leads. But the way they were hidden, the way the necklace was wrapped carefully in tissue paper, I knew. Thomas faces an impossible ethical dilemma. Revealing his discovery means destroying his father's legacy and possibly triggering a scandal that would devastate his mother's remaining friends. Staying silent means perpetuating the injustice that has already lasted nearly 3 decades. He chooses truth. The call to the Maple Ridge Police Department is initially met with confusion. Cold cases aren't priorities, especially those officially classified as runaways. But when Thomas mentions the necklace and his father's name, the dispatcher's tone changes dramatically. "I'll have someone call you back," she says. Within an hour, Detective Mara Ellison is on the line. Detective Ellison has been with the Maple Ridge Police Department for just under 2 years, long enough to know the town's history, but not long enough to be entangled in its past secrets. When the call about Raymond Holt and a missing necklace comes in, she recognizes the potential significance immediately. Reopening a 27-year-old case isn't a decision made lightly, Ellison explains, but finding physical evidence that had been in the possession of a former deputy, evidence that should have been logged and preserved as part of the investigation, that's not just a cold case. That's potential obstruction of justice by a law enforcement officer. Ellison drives to Eugene that same afternoon to meet with Thomas Holt. The necklace is placed in an evidence bag, its tarnished surface photographed from multiple angles. The folder of newspaper clippings joins it, along with the Polaroid and handwritten notes. "I was already convinced this was Amy Garrison's necklace," Ellison says, "but we needed confirmation." The confirmation comes through an unlikely source. The local jewelry store where Frank Garrison purchased the necklace in 1979 is still in business, now run by the original owner's son. The store's records from that era have been digitized, including the custom engraving orders. There it is in faded but legible script. Silver pendant, heart-shaped, to be engraved AG for Amy Garrison. The order matches the necklace found in Raymond Holt's belongings. With the necklace authenticated, Detective Ellison formally reopens the investigation into Amy Garrison's disappearance. What begins as a possible evidence mishandling case escalates into something far darker: the realization that Amy's story might have been deliberately suppressed by someone inside the sheriff's department. The next step is clear but painful. Laura Garrison must be notified. Laura Garrison has built a life around the absence of answers. After her father's death in 2001, she remained in Maple Ridge, working as a school counselor, helping other people's children navigate their troubles while her own remained unresolved. She never married, never had children, never left the small house where she once waited for her sister to come home. "I'd made my peace with never knowing," Laura tells me, her hands trembling slightly as she recounts receiving Detective Ellison's call. Not real peace, maybe, but a kind of acceptance. The kind where you stop expecting answers because the questions hurt too much. The phone rings on a Tuesday evening in early spring. Laura answers without thinking, the way she has answered thousands of calls over the years. "Miss Garrison? This is Detective Mara Ellison from the Maple Ridge Police Department. I'm calling about your sister, Amy." 27 years collapse into a single moment. Laura's carefully constructed acceptance shatters. "I thought they'd found her body," Laura says. "That's where my mind went first. That someone had finally found her remains in the woods or at the bottom of a lake. I never imagined they'd found her necklace, and I certainly never imagined where they'd found it." Detective Ellison arranges to meet Laura in person, bringing photographs of the necklace rather than the item itself, which has been sent to the state crime lab for analysis. The moment Laura sees the photos, she knows. "That's hers," she whispers. "That's Amy's necklace. Where did you find it?" The answer, that it was found among the personal effects of former Deputy Raymond Holt, hits Laura like a physical blow. She's known Holt her entire life. He coached her Little League team. He led the search for Amy. He attended her father's funeral. It was like finding out gravity isn't real, Laura says. Everything I thought I understood about the world just collapsed. With the necklace as catalyst, Detective Ellison assembles a small team to review Amy's original case files. What they find, or rather, what they don't find, is telling. The file was incomplete, Ellison explains. Witness statements mentioned in the log were missing. Evidence forms had been started, but never completed. The case had all the appearances of a thorough investigation, but crucial components were absent. More disturbing still, records showed that Raymond Holt had checked out portions of the file multiple times between 1984 and 1995, ostensibly for review purposes. Each time the files were returned, but there was no way to verify that they were returned intact or unaltered. We were essentially reconstructing a case where the primary evidence had been in the custody of our main suspect, Ellison says. It doesn't get much more compromised than that. The investigation expands beyond the physical evidence. Ellison's team begins re-interviewing surviving witnesses, including Marianne Clark, who has moved to Seattle but agrees to speak via video call. I always felt something was off about how they handled Amy's case, Marianne admits during her interview. The way they kept pushing this runaway narrative when it made no sense to anyone who knew her, and the way Deputy Holt inserted himself into everything, offering to drive me home after my statement, asking all these questions about whether Amy had mentioned running away, whether she had a boyfriend in another town. Marianne pauses, then adds the detail she'd retracted all those years ago. I did see Amy walking past the Miller Creek sign that night. I was absolutely certain of it. But Deputy Holt told my parents it would be better if I wasn't so specific about the time and place, that it might confuse the investigation. My dad thought he was just being helpful. Other witnesses emerge with similar stories, subtle pressure to modify statements, details omitted from official reports, suggestions that certain observations might be misremembered. The pattern becomes unmistakable. Raymond Holt had systematically steered the investigation away from himself while appearing to be its most dedicated advocate. Physical evidence holds emotional residue. The necklace, carrying 27 years of dust, history, and unanswered questions, becomes a conduit to the past. Homes keep stories their owners never intended to tell. The forensic examination of the necklace yields unexpected results. Despite decades of storage, trace evidence remains. Skin cells trapped in the clasp mechanism, a partial fingerprint preserved by tarnish, microscopic fibers embedded in the chain links. DNA extraction from the skin cells produces a partial profile. It's not enough for a definitive identification, but when compared to a DNA sample from Laura Garrison, the familial match is clear. The cells belong to a close female relative, almost certainly Amy herself. The fingerprint is more problematic. Degraded by time and tarnish, it provides only 7 points of comparison rather than the 12 typically required for identification. However, when compared to Raymond Holt's prints from his personnel file, 6 of the 7 points match. The necklace tells its own story. It was last worn by Amy Garrison and last handled by Raymond Holt. But the evidence doesn't stop with the necklace. Thomas Holt continues searching through his father's belongings, finding a locked metal box inside one of the storage containers. When opened, it reveals a collection of Polaroid film canisters, several exposed but never developed. I didn't want to look, Thomas admits, but I knew I had to. He brings the undeveloped film to Detective Ellison, who sends it to the State Crime Lab for specialized processing. The technicians warn that after nearly 3 decades, the chemicals have likely degraded too much to produce clear images. They're wrong. 3 of the 5 rolls yield recognizable photographs. The images are grainy, discolored by time, but unmistakable. The abandoned paper mill at night. The bridge over Millview Creek. A school backpack lying on forest ground, a tag clearly visible. AG. The photographs are dated November 7th, 1983, 2 days after Amy disappeared. These weren't investigative photos, Ellison explains. They were never logged as evidence. They were never shared with the search team. They were private photographs taken by someone who knew exactly where to look, because he knew exactly what had happened. The attic has yielded its ghosts, forcing Maple Ridge to confront a truth it had deliberately forgotten. Amy Garrison didn't run away. She was taken. And the man who took her spent the next 19 years living among them, respected and revered, until his death in 2002. But the most disturbing revelation is yet to come. With Detective Ellison's help, Laura Garrison revisits the case files, both those officially preserved and those recovered from Raymond Holt's storage. Pages are missing. Tape recordings cut halfway. Witness statements contradict each other in ways that now seem deliberate rather than coincidental. One section catches Laura's eye. Deputy Holt's field notes from 1983. Copied but poorly redacted. They mention blood sample submission in an evidence log that was never filed. Blood? Laura asks, the word hanging in the air between her and Detective Ellison. They found blood? Ellison reviews the notes carefully. According to this, a blood sample was collected from the area near where Amy's jacket was found. Holt logged it for submission to the state lab, but there's no record of it ever arriving there. So he kept it, Laura says, her voice hollow, like he kept her necklace. The implications are too painful to articulate fully. If blood was found, if Holt concealed that evidence, then Amy's disappearance was never a missing persons case. It was always a homicide investigation deliberately derailed by the officer assigned to solve it. As the investigation deepens, vehicle logs from 1983 reveal a pattern that should have raised red flags decades earlier. Deputy Holt reported his department-issued white Ford truck in maintenance for 3 days following Amy's disappearance, an unusual duration for routine service. Detective Ellison tracks down records from the county motor pool. The maintenance order exists, but something doesn't align with Holt's report. The truck wasn't in for mechanical issues. It was being washed, detailed, and repainted. The work order specifically mentions scratch repair and repainting of passenger side panel and door, Ellison notes. That's extensive cosmetic work, not routine maintenance. More telling still, the work was authorized by Sheriff Palmer himself rather than the usual fleet manager. The timing, immediately after Amy's disappearance, cannot be coincidental. They knew, Laura says when shown the documents. Maybe not everything, maybe not the details, but they knew something had happened involving that truck, and they helped cover it up. The truck repainting suggests not just individual misconduct by Holt, but institutional complicity. The very system meant to investigate Amy's disappearance had instead conspired to conceal it. The Polaroid camera recovered from Holt's belongings yields more than just the undeveloped film. The camera itself, a Polaroid Sun 600 popular in the early 1980s, contains its own secrets. Forensic examination reveals latent fingerprints on the interior film compartment, prints matching Amy Garrison's from her school records. The implication is clear. Amy had handled the camera, possibly on the night she disappeared. We believe Holt used the camera as a lure, Detective Ellison explains. Based on witness statements and the evidence pattern, our working theory is that he intercepted Amy on her walk home, possibly offering her a ride or using the camera as a pretext to engage with her. The scenario aligns with what is now understood about predatory behavior, the use of props or pretexts to establish initial contact, the exploitation of authority to gain compliance, the careful selection of victims and circumstances. Amy knew him, Laura says, the realization washing over her anew. She would have trusted him. If he offered her a ride, said he'd take her home safely, she would have gotten in that truck without hesitation. The trust that should have protected Amy had instead delivered her to her abductor. As the truth emerges, Laura's relationship with her father's memory becomes complicated. Frank Garrison died never knowing what happened to his daughter, his last years consumed by futile searches and rejected theories. Dad always insisted someone local took Amy, Laura tells me. He had these lists, names of people he thought might be involved. Raymond Holt was never on those lists. Dad trusted him completely. They were friends. The revelation that her father had unknowingly befriended his daughter's killer creates a new dimension of trauma for Laura. In one painful interview, she admits a terrible suspicion. Her father might have known more than he admitted. There was one night, maybe a year after Amy disappeared, Dad came home late, drunk, which wasn't like him. He kept saying, "I should have seen it. I should have known." I thought he was just blaming himself generally. But now I wonder, did he suspect? Did he have some moment of clarity about Ray that he couldn't bear to face? The question cannot be answered. Frank Garrison took whatever suspicions he might have harbored to his grave. For Thomas Holt, the psychological impact is equally devastating. The father he revered has become a monster. The childhood he remembers is now shadowed by the knowledge of what his father did. I keep going back through memories, looking for signs, Thomas says. Was there something off about him that I missed? Were there moments when the mask slipped? I don't know if I want to find those moments or if I'm terrified that I will. Both Laura and Thomas find themselves trapped in a peculiar limbo, mourning not only those they lost, but the truth of who those people were. Their grief has no roadmap, no established rituals. How do you grieve a sister who was taken by someone you trusted? Laura asks. How do you honor the father who never found justice without blaming him for not seeing what was right in front of him? There are no answers, only the slow, painful process of integrating this new reality. As Detective Ellison's team assembles the evidence against Raymond Holt, a disturbing pattern emerges from his career history. Old newspaper columns and department newsletters reveal that Holt led several youth patrol programs and had regular access to teenagers during local events. He volunteered for after-school traffic duty at Maple Ridge High School. He chaperoned school dances and sporting events. He organized the annual Safety Day for elementary students. Yet searching through department records, Ellison finds no documentation of these programs, no attendance lists, no photographs, no formal reports. It's as if he deliberately kept his youth work off the books, Ellison observes, which raises the question, was Amy his only victim or the only one we know about? The question sends investigators searching through decades of records from surrounding counties, looking for similar disappearances or unsolved cases involving teenage girls. The pattern they uncover is chilling. Between 1976 and 1990, 3 other teenage girls went missing within a 100-mile radius of Maple Ridge. All 3 cases were classified as runaways. None of the girls were ever found. And in 2 of those cases, Raymond Holt had volunteered to assist with the investigations, despite them being outside his jurisdiction. We don't have enough evidence to definitively link Holt to these other disappearances, Ellison cautions, but the pattern is concerning, to say the least. The possibility that Amy was not an isolated victim but part of a series adds a new dimension of horror to the case. It also reinforces the urgency of finding her remains, not just for closure, but to determine if forensic evidence might connect to these other unsolved cases. As the investigation progresses, it becomes clear that the failure to solve Amy's case wasn't just Raymond Holt's crime. It was a systemic breakdown across multiple levels of authority. Archived memos show that Holt's reports on Amy's case were cross-signed by Sheriff Palmer, who later resigned under allegations of mishandled evidence in a separate case, also involving a missing teenage girl. Palmer had authorized the unusual truck maintenance without question. He had dismissed the bloodhound findings without investigation. He had redirected resources away from the most promising search areas. It wasn't just Holt, Laura says bitterly. It was the whole system protecting itself. One officer's crime became everyone's secret to keep. The pattern extended beyond law enforcement. Several townspeople had worked together to backdate witness statements, afraid exposure would ruin Maple Ridge's reputation for safety. School officials had characterized Amy as troubled, despite her solid academic record. Local reporters had accepted the runaway narrative without pushing for evidence. "We thought she ran away," one former neighbor admits during a re-interview. "We didn't want to believe otherwise. It was easier that way. Safer." The collective rationalization had created a perfect environment for Holt's crime to remain buried, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because no one wanted to see it. Detective Ellison calls a town hall meeting to announce the reopening of Amy's case. The community center fills beyond capacity, a mix of older residents who remember the original investigation and younger ones who know Amy only as a local legend. "We have recovered evidence that significantly changes our understanding of what happened to Amy Garrison in 1983, Ellison tells the crowd. "This evidence strongly suggests she was the victim of a crime, not a runaway, and that her disappearance may have been deliberately mishandled by individuals within the sheriff's department at that time." The revelation sends shockwaves through the room. Reporters scribble notes, neighbors exchange glances. The entire town bristles, a collective defense mechanism forged from decades of denial. "You're accusing Ray Holt," one elderly man calls out, "a decorated officer who served this town for 30 years, a man who can't defend himself because he's been dead for 8 years. How is that justice?" Others voice similar concerns. The accusations seem impossible to reconcile with the Raymond Holt they knew, the youth baseball coach, the church deacon, the officer who helped find lost dogs and checked on elderly residents during storms. But some remain silent, their expressions troubled. They're the ones who noticed things over the years but dismissed them. Holt's unusual interest in teenage girls, his volunteer work that put him in constant contact with minors, the way he sometimes watched young women when he thought no one was looking. "I saw him once," a woman in her 50s confesses to Detective Ellison after the meeting. "Parked near the high school track during girls' practice, just sitting in his truck, watching. I thought it was odd, but he was a police officer. Who questions that?" The town divides along fault lines of denial and acceptance. Some residents want to move on, arguing that nothing can be gained by tarnishing Holt's memory or revisiting a tragedy from decades ago. Others demand truth, regardless of where it leads or who it implicates. The moral reckoning extends beyond Raymond Holt. If he committed this crime, if he abducted and likely murdered Amy Garrison, he did so within a community that failed to see the warning signs, failed to question inconsistencies, and ultimately chose comfortable fiction over difficult truth. As Laura tells the assembled crowd, her voice steady despite the emotion beneath, "You all watched my family fall apart after Amy disappeared. You watched my father search these woods every weekend until his health failed. You attended his funeral and told me how much you admired his dedication. But how many of you knew something and said nothing? How many of you chose silence?" No one answers. No one can. DNA analysis from the necklace clasp confirms what Laura already knew. The cells preserved there belonged to her sister Amy. The fingerprint comparison, while not definitive, strongly suggests Raymond Holt was the last person to handle it before it was hidden in his attic. The evidence is mounting, but the most crucial piece remains elusive. Amy's remains have never been found. Without a body, the investigation can prove Holt's involvement in her disappearance, but cannot definitively establish that he killed her, though the circumstantial evidence points overwhelmingly in that direction. "We need to find her," Laura tells Detective Ellison, "not just for legal closure, but for peace. I need to bring her home." The search focuses on areas connected to Raymond Holt, his former property in the valley, the abandoned paper mill where he was often seen, the wooded areas he insisted didn't need searching in 1983. Cadaver dogs trained to detect decades-old remains scour the terrain, ground-penetrating radar searches for disturbed soil patterns. For weeks, the search yields nothing. Then a breakthrough comes from an unexpected source. Investigators return to Holt's attic storage, conducting a more thorough examination of the containers Thomas had found. Beneath the floorboards of the attic itself, they discover a small cloth pouch containing a rusted key and a fragment of a photograph showing part of the mill bridge. The key belongs to a type of padlock commonly used on the paper mill's maintenance sheds, structures that still stand despite the mill's abandonment decades earlier. The photograph shows the bridge from an unusual angle, one that isn't visible from the main road or hiking trails. Using the photograph as a guide, search teams locate the exact vantage point where it was taken, a secluded clearing accessible only by a narrow deer path approximately half a mile behind the abandoned mill site. The area would have been completely obscured from regular search parties in 1983, especially if they were being directed away from this section of woods by the very person who knew what they might find there. The clearing shows signs of long-ago disturbance, a depression, in the earth that has settled unevenly over decades, unlike the natural forest floor around it. Ground-penetrating radar confirms what the visual inspection suggests. Something was buried here and has since decomposed. The excavation begins carefully, archaeological in its precision. Layer by layer, the earth is removed and sifted for evidence. 2 feet down, the first piece appears, a tarnished metal button from a denim jacket, identical to those on the jacket Amy was wearing the night she disappeared. "It's her," Laura whispers, watching from a distance. "You found her?" The excavation continues, ultimately revealing fabric remnants matching Amy's missing clothes, buried under soil deposits dated to winter 1983-84. Personal items emerge, a hair clip, the remnants of a leather bracelet, a partial school ID card. And finally, human remains, fragmented by time and the acidic forest soil, but unmistakably those of a teenage girl. DNA confirmation takes weeks, but the results are conclusive. The remains belong to Amy Garrison. After 27 years, she has finally been found. The forensic examination reveals a final, terrible truth. Fracture patterns on the recovered cranial fragments indicate blunt force trauma, evidence that Amy died from a violent blow to the head. The manner of death is ruled homicide. Raymond Holt, beyond the reach of earthly justice, stands posthumously convicted in the court of evidence, if not law. The man who led the search for Amy Garrison was the very person who ensured she would never be found, until now. The discovery of Amy's remains sends ripples through Maple Ridge, a community that had built its identity partly on being safe, wholesome, protected from the darkness of the outside world, must now confront the monster that lived at its center. "It's like finding out your house is built on quicksand," one longtime resident tells me. "Everything you thought was solid wasn't." The reckoning extends beyond Raymond Holt to the institutions that shielded him. The Sheriff's Department faces an external investigation into the original handling of Amy's case. Sheriff Palmer, long retired and living in Arizona, refuses all interview requests. Former deputies who worked alongside Holt during the 1983 investigation issue careful statements expressing shock and dismay, insisting they had no knowledge of his involvement. But the questions remain. How could they not have known? How could they have missed the signs? And if they did see those signs, why did they choose to look away? For some in Maple Ridge, Hinain Sanzisanane Maple Ridge, the answers are too painful to confront. They retreat into denial, insisting the evidence must be mistaken, that Raymond Holt couldn't possibly have committed such a crime. The softball field named after him becomes a flashpoint, some demanding the name be removed, others insisting his unproven guilt shouldn't erase decades of community service. It's not about protecting Holt's memory, Laura says during a contentious town meeting. It's about protecting your own. Because if Ray did this, if he took my sister and killed her and hid her body, and you all trusted him, welcomed him into your homes, let him near your children for 20 years afterward, what does that make you? The question hangs in the air, unanswerable. Some residents light candles in their windows on the night Amy's remains are finally laid to rest in the town cemetery. Others stay home, doors closed, blinds drawn. A local reporter writes, Maple Ridge solved its oldest mystery but lost its innocence doing so. The truth, of course, is that the innocence was always an illusion. The darkness didn't come from outside. It grew from within, nurtured by silence and watered with denial. For Laura Garrison, the discovery of her sister's remains brings a complicated mixture of relief and renewed grief. The uncertainty that haunted her for nearly 3 decades has ended. She knows what happened to Amy. She knows who took her. She can finally lay her sister to rest with dignity. But the closure, when it arrives this late, tastes bitter. I keep thinking about my dad, Laura tells me as we sit on her porch, looking toward the forest where Amy was found. He died never knowing. He searched those woods for years, probably passed within a few hundred yards of where she was buried dozens of times. And all the while he considered Ray Holt a friend. They had coffee together. They went fishing. He trusted the man who killed his daughter. The cruelty of this reality, that Frank Garrison died believing his friend was helping search for Amy when in fact he was ensuring she would never be found, weighs heavily on Laura. It's a final injustice that cannot be undone. What would knowing have done to him? Laura wonders. Would it have destroyed him completely? Or would it have given him some kind of, I don't know, not peace, but something like it, certainty at least? For Thomas Holt, the resolution brings its own painful reckoning. His father, the man he admired and emulated, was responsible for unimaginable harm. The legacy he inherited is not one of service and respect, but of deceit and violence. I changed my name, Thomas admits during our final interview. Moved to another state, started over. But you can't really escape something like this. It follows you. It's in your DNA. Despite having no personal culpability in his father's crimes, Thomas feels a responsibility to the Garrison family, a debt he can never fully repay, but attempts to address through his cooperation with the investigation and his ongoing support for a scholarship fund established in Amy's name. It doesn't balance the scales, he acknowledges. Nothing could, but it's something. A way of saying, the Holt family sees what was done to you and we stand with you, not with him. This gesture, small against the enormity of what happened, but significant in its sincerity, represents perhaps the only true healing to emerge from decades of pain. As our investigation concludes, the physical evidence paints a clear picture of what happened on November 5th, 1983. Raymond Holt, patrolling the area near Millview Road, encountered Amy Garrison walking home. Using his position of authority, and possibly his camera as a pretext, he convinced her to get into his truck. He took her to a secluded location near the abandoned mill, where he assaulted and ultimately killed her. He buried her body in the woods, kept her necklace as a trophy, and then led the investigation that was supposedly trying to find her. He directed searchers away from the actual crime scene, dismissed evidence that pointed toward his involvement, and manipulated witnesses to support his preferred narrative of Amy as a runaway. For nearly 20 years after her death, he lived in Maple Ridge as a respected officer and community member. He attended Amy's memorial services. He counseled her grieving father. He received commendations for his dedicated work on missing persons cases. And when he died in 2002, the town mourned him as a hero, never knowing, or perhaps never acknowledging, the monster that lived behind the badge. The most terrifying thing, Laura reflects as our time together draws to a close, isn't that one man could do something so horrible, it's that an entire community could miss the signs, or worse, see them and decide to look away. The attic where Amy's necklace waited for 27 years has been cleared out, its secrets exposed to light. The forest clearing where she was buried has been marked with a small stone memorial. The physical evidence has been cataloged, preserved, understood. But the echo of what happened, the ripples of one violent act across decades of silence, continues to reverberate through Maple Ridge and beyond. It reminds us that evil rarely announces itself with dramatic gestures or obvious malice. It hides in plain sight, wearing the uniform of authority, speaking the language of protection, building trust it intends to betray. It reminds us that the most dangerous predators aren't strangers lurking in shadows, but the familiar faces we've been taught to trust without question. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that silence in the face of suspicion isn't safety, it's complicity, it's permission for darkness to grow. 4 decades after Amy Garrison disappeared from a road that should have taken 9 minutes to walk, the truth of what happened to her no longer lives in whispers or newspaper ink. It lives in evidence logs and DNA reports. It lives in the carefully preserved remains now resting in Maple Ridge Cemetery. It lives in the memories of those who knew her and those who searched for her. But it also lives in the silence between those who chose to forget and the one sister who never could. The necklace that unlocked this decades-old case now rests in an evidence locker. Its journey from Amy's neck to Raymond Holt's attic to the state crime lab, a testament to the persistence of physical truth. Objects remember what people choose to forget. They hold secrets longer than conspiracies of silence can contain them. Sometimes the thing you lose doesn't fade away, Laura tells me as we conclude our final interview. It waits for the moment someone is ready to see it again. In Amy's case, that moment came 27 years too late for justice to be served in any conventional sense. Raymond Holt died never having faced accountability for his actions. The institutions that failed to detect his crimes or actively helped conceal them have largely evaded formal consequences. But if justice is ultimately about truth rather than punishment, perhaps a kind of justice has finally been achieved. The truth of what happened to Amy Garrison is now known. The man responsible has been identified. The narrative of the runaway teenager has been permanently corrected to reflect the reality of a young woman who was taken against her will by someone who abused his position of trust. For Laura, this knowledge brings a measure of peace, however bittersweet. I used to dream about Amy coming home, she says. For years after she disappeared, I'd wake up thinking I heard her voice or her footsteps in the hallway. Those dreams eventually stopped. But after we found her, after we buried her properly, I dreamed about her again. Just once. She was sitting on the edge of my bed, wearing that silver necklace, smiling. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Laura returns to the creek where Amy's footprints once stopped, the place where we now know Raymond Holt intercepted her on her walk home. She kneels at the water's edge, watching the current ripple over stones worn smooth by time. In her hand, she holds a replica of Amy's necklace, created for her by the same jewelry store that made the original. The silver heart catches the light as Laura gently places it into the water. For a moment, it floats on the surface, reflecting the sky above. Then it sinks slowly, coming to rest among the stones beneath the clear water. A pause. Then, the sound of distant wind through the trees. A whisper, like a name being carried home. If small details in this story felt familiar, you're not imagining it. Hundreds of missing persons cases across the country share the same overlooked signs. The trusted authority figure whose interest in youth programs goes unquestioned. The inconsistencies in official reports that are dismissed rather than investigated. The community pressure to accept comforting narratives over uncomfortable questions. These patterns repeat because we allow them to, because we choose not to see what's right in front of us, not to question those we've designated as beyond suspicion, not to believe victims when their stories implicate people we respect. Amy Garrison's case reminds us that evil rarely announces itself. It builds trust, establishes authority, creates a facade so convincing that even when cracks appear, we rationalize them away rather than peer inside. It reminds us that small towns can harbor darkness as deep as any city, perhaps deeper, because the silence is more complete, the pressure to maintain appearances more intense, the illusion of safety more carefully preserved. But most of all, it reminds us that truth, no matter how deeply buried, finds its way to the surface eventually. Sometimes through an object preserved in an attic, sometimes through a witness who finally speaks up, sometimes through the persistence of those who refuse to stop asking questions. If you know something about a case that has gone cold, if you've noticed details that don't quite align, if you've carried a suspicion you were afraid to voice, consider this. Your silence protects only those who don't deserve protection. The truth, however painful, is the only path to healing for victims, for families, for communities. And sometimes that truth is hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to see it.